Everybody on our live stream for our Yom Hashoah commemoration. We're delighted to have Walter Wegg, who is well known to so many members at the Ark Synagogue. I can't actually remember when you became a member of the community, but you'll tell us maybe in a few moments. But I can't remember NPLS, Northern and Pinner Liberal Synagogue, the Ark Synagogue, without having Walter with us. He has been such an ever-present part of my life and of so many people's lives. Walter taught many of us in Cheder. We're your big children now, Walter, and it's wonderful that we grew up alongside your children as well. And we feel very honoured to have you speaking with us today. So over to you, Walter, to speak as you wish. And when you're finished, we'll ask for a few questions. That we'll be asking for something no longer than 20-second questions. No statements or anything else like that. Just very, very simple questions to allow Walter to be able to speak today. So, Walter.
Thank you, Rabbi Aaron. Thank you for asking me to give this talk. I feel very diffident about it all, but it is a great honor. And I have been, my wife Sylvia and I and our family have been members since about 1974. That's quite a long time, is it not? And of course, your father, Rabbi Dr. Andrew Goldstein, was the rabbi then. And it was a quite a different synagogue in Hallowell Road, in an older Methodist church building. We are privileged to have such a much better Ark Synagogue now. And I'm going to talk to you now about my life, because regarding the Holocaust, I actually grew up in Nazi Germany and didn't come to this country until just before the war. Nobody wants to become a refugee. So why are there so many refugees now in this world? It is really rather a depressing thought. And I'm hoping that you will have a good solution to this problem in the current world. Maybe we can learn from the experience of people like myself. I grew up in Germany, a very civilized European country, in Leipzig, a little south of Berlin. It's a big city in Saxony in Germany, and it's known for its music, its culture, its books, and its fur trade. My father was in business as a antiquarian book publisher with his two older brothers, Uncle Franz and Uncle Otto to me. And my father was helping in his father's footsteps. His father set up the firm, which was well known throughout the world, especially in academic circles. I was the eldest born in 1928. I was the eldest of three. I had two younger sisters. I have two younger sisters, I'm glad to say. And as we three grew up very closely with three of our cousins. Ozil, a year and a half older than me, Stefan, about 3 or 4 years younger than me, and Misha, born in 19 35 or so. So the three of them were close to us. They were the children of my mother's oldest brother, Uncle Rudolph to us, married to Auntie Bella. And they lived two roads away from us in the Steinstraße in Leipzig, whereas we lived in the Kantstraße. And it was easy for us to walk the two roads, and we were often together. It was my cousins lived in the same house as our mother's parents, Max Breslauer and Oma Etta. He had actually founded the firm that stood opposite the building that the block of flats that he had designed with an architect. And it stood opposite the factory that he had founded. It had created and produced fine photographic material. And in those days, it was mainly black and white. And the photographic process was not digital. And it was quite involved. And he used an offset printing design, which was quite modern in those days. Of course, I'm talking now about 92 years ago, when life was very different. And I'm just going to sketch in how it was in Germany. It got a bit rather colder than here in the winter. So we could see the ice rink, which was a tennis court in the summer. And we used to go skating there. And my sister and I used to go over there and have our skates fixed for us for a small fee. And we enjoyed skating. We did other things as well, like swimming, and also in the winter, perhaps skiing. We were in a middle-income family, and we really enjoyed life. It was a good life. We actually went to theatre and other things as well, which any reasonably well-off family can enjoy. Of course, when it came to having a kindergarten, the mothers joined together with their friends and family, and we had a kindergarten group that used to meet. We'd be hosted by different people. In the summer, it was often the garden in my grandparents' house, which was very much in preference. And that was something that we enjoyed being in. The other things we did, of course, we also went on holidays, even abroad. And we did enjoy also having lessons in handicraft and other activities that I must tell you, though, in those days, it was considered important that boys did boys' things and girls did girls' things. And the interesting thing in the handicrafts was knitting was only for the girls, whereas dolly down the reel was okay for boys. Mostly the boys did fret sewing work not something for the girls. There were all sorts of other things that were considered correct or incorrect. For instance, pushing a pram was not done by the men. It's all right for a boy to do it, whereas there were. When my father went on business to England and came back with stories, one of the things he said, I saw men pushing prams and pushing the prams, of course, in those days were quite large, not as smart and foldable as they are now. Of course, we lived on the third floor in our block of flats, no lift. So the prams were housed down in the basement, together with an enclosure which each of the 8 flats had. And the pram used to be covered over and stood beside the coal, which was delivered by a horse-drawn cart. They were briquettes, mined fairly locally. It's mainly coal dust, but it was made into briquettes, which were quite handy. All our rooms were heated in those days by a stove, which needed to be set up every morning, and my father used to do that. And he also used to bring the coal up from the basement. The milkman came to the door with a large jug, which was immediately poured into a large saucepan and boiled. We didn't have milk delivered in glass bottles. The other thing was we did have electricity in the house, but we cooked by gas, and we didn't have central heating, whereas the carefully designed house of my mother's parents did have central heating, which was quite amazing. They also had a doggy, a little dachshund, which was on a long lead. And we were rather shy we children were rather shy of this, as it was quite an active little doggy. My uncle and aunt lived in the flat above those of my grandparents. And my uncle Rudolph had quite a number of smart pets, including a reptile, an oxalotl in a glass case. We at home had for a while a little bird, a canary, which we tried to help look after, but one day, unfortunately, it escaped out of the window, and there was no more bird. An aunt had a doggy, which was rather a nice poodle, which my sister liked taking for a walk. And of course, eventually it was time for me to go to school. In Germany at that time, school year started just after Easter, so in the spring. And in the first day of school, I was presented with a large cornucopia of sweets, and that was the custom in those days. To go to the local school where I could just walk from home, my father considered ideal. So that's where I went. My first year, it was a few roads to cross by the traffic lights, and the main, we were Jewish people in the southern parts of Leipzig, most of the more from Jewish people lived in the northern part of the city, which was 2 tram rides away. And my father thought, anyway, it is best for local people to know what Jews look like, and there's nothing to be worried about. So he felt we should go to the local school. My cousin of a year and a half older had already gone to that school, and I enjoyed the first year. We had a very nice teacher. In the second year, however, things became rather different. I found that the teacher directed the pupils who were giving out things for us to do during the class not to give it to the Jewish boy. I, being the only Jewish boy in the class, thought, well, that's all right. I can help my neighbor instead. But it wasn't quite as easy as that. At the end of the class, the teacher made me stand up, and she roundly told me how nasty Jews were, made me stand in the corner. Now, this happened several times, and my parents said I never mentioned it to them, but things gradually got more serious on the road too. When we went to go and have our skis fitted, they no longer fitted, skates fitted, ice skates fitted. They no longer fitted them for Jews. So my wonderful grandma gave us a new set of ice skates so they could be fitted without such asking. And we still had, I remember when we came out rather hungry out of the skating, there was always a man with Turkish delight to sell. So we had rather a nice time. However, why did it become a bit like that? That Jews, they started calling us in the streets Jew, and all kinds of nasty calls made us rather aware that we were not that welcome. There was a deliberate attempt by the government to downgrade Jews, and you probably know it all about it now. But to us, it was all rather new. There was an underlying anti-Semitism in the country, but it was certainly stimulated by the government once Hitler came to power in 1934. So my sister, who went to school a year later, went straight to the Karlbach-Schule in the northern part of Leipzig. And she was quite happy there with lots of all Jewish children. We were in a mixed boys and girls, whereas I was in a school where the boys were separated from the girls. My older cousin transferred schools about that time too. So I was the only one in our family still left in the school there. And one day when I came home with my 2 friends, they started throwing stones at me. So, all right, I threw a few back. But then when we got onto the main road, other older boys started doing the same thing and calling loudly, foul-mouthing me as a Jew. So I saw a policeman. My mother had always told me, if you're in a fix and don't know where you are or need help, do ask a policeman. But lo and behold, the policeman actually egged them on to do more stoning. And to my surprise, that I realized there was not much help. I knew I had to dash away quickly. And luckily for me, nobody followed me home. But the next day, my father took me to the Karlbach-Schule as well. So I was now we were all now in the Jewish school, with all people like me having to go to the one Jewish school, which was set up deliberately, prominently for the more the Jews who were more observant. It was far too small. So the school had to change our timetable. So some of us would go in very early in the morning at 7 o'clock, and others much later. So I no longer went at the same time as my sister, who was a year below me. We went at different times and on different days. In the meantime, we found that there were all kinds of laws which prohibited us from going to plays and using the same areas of playing as we used to. And I no longer played with the children in the street. We were kept rather separate. Well, that's all right for the moment. We didn't know what was going to happen. One day, it was in November, I was on the early shift. So I was up very early and was going we went by 2 trams. The trams were very good service. The overhead take up, but they had rails on there. They were not trolley buses, they were actually trams. And I had to change at the main square. And when we arrived there, I could hear all kinds of unusual activities of police and fire service. And 2 people sitting opposite me in a fairly empty tram. One was saying to the other, "It's the Jews, you know, they've got it coming to them." I became rather apprehensive, looked out of the window and found there was smoke coming out of Bamberger and Hats, which was a Jewish firm. We used to get our clothes, and they also had shoe fitting using X-rays, which was rather fun for us. I looked further, and there behind there was more fire. And later on, I heard that was actually our synagogue on fire. Now, this is a big synagogue, the Liberale Schule, the Liberale Synagogue in Leipzig. We all used to go there, not every week, but on high days and holy days, we used to go there. And of course, I sat with my father downstairs, and the ladies were all in the gallery upstairs. So my sister was with my mother upstairs. However, it was, and I never had a seat. I just shared this special seat that my father had. So it was quite a lot of standing, but I didn't mind in those days. I didn't tell you also that we used to have religion school once a week until we were all in the rabbis used to take it in turn to give us this religion school once a week. But once we were in the Karlbach-Schule, we had to learn Hebrew very quickly, and it was rather exciting to do that. I remember I enjoyed making nice letters, and they were very well taught. It was a very good quality school. So that day, with all the activities going on, I decided I wouldn't change at the main square there. And I'd change at the next square where it was possible to change to the next tram. But it wasn't much better there. I got on the next tram and got to the school. And unusually, although there were lots of horses around, the streets were always well cleaned. Unusually, there was lots of glass all over the pavement. It came from windows upstairs, I could see. So I went round the corner to the school, and to my absolute despair, there were books half burnt, thrown all over, halfway across the road, and the cars were still trying to find their way by. And as I was wondering, should I go up? There was nobody else around. Should I go up to those steps to the main gates there? Suddenly, a youngster, a young man, tall young man, appeared at my side and said, "Keine Schule heute, Kleiner." No school today, little one. So I realized something was going on. And I quickly went back the way I'd come, back to the tram stop. And I thought I'd better go, not the way I'd come. I'd go around another way, which meant past some Jewish shops. And each one of those Jewish shops was daubed with a swastika or something else. And the windows were broken, and the passers-by were picking their way carefully over the broken glass with the unusually unclean streets. I got back to the tram just as my sister was about to alight. And I said to her, we must go back quickly, straight away, because there's no school today. And she was asking, why no school? What's happened? And I didn't want to talk very much in our tram, because we were almost the only passengers, in case we were taken off the tram and left to walk home. So I didn't say anything until we had the last few steps to go home. That the school, that something really nasty had happened overnight. Nobody had phoned us. We had a dial phone at home. One of those things where you dial rather than press buttons. It's a rather large instrument, all black. Nobody dared phone us during the morning. And of course, that's why we didn't know that it had been what was called Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass. It was worse than that, of course. We noticed immediately that there were black maras, people from various parts, we didn't even know that they were Jewish, were being taken, men were being taken over, I think the age of 18, were being taken away. My mother returned from the office where my father was, knowing that we would be getting home. She realized that, and we were very worried what's going to happen. A year or so earlier, my uncle Rudolph had said, we may need to move away. He went to Holland and with a colleague set up, joined a firm very similar to the kind of work they were doing in the Steinstrasse with a fine photographic business. And on Kristallnacht, or just after, or just before, I think he managed to get his family, that is my three cousins, also Stefan and Misha, who was only 4 years old, 3 years old, two actually, very small, to Holland. Now, things got far worse very quickly. We now know, of course, many homes were broken into by ruffians who took the menfolk away to concentration camp. My father still came home that night, but it was 2 nights later, early in the morning, 5 o'clock, there was a loud knock on the door. And I was looking out of our children's bedroom. I could see at the front door, there was quite a young officer in uniform. He came to the door and said, "My father's to come immediately, take nothing, and he would be taken away." My mother quickly, I noticed, got some sandwiches together, put them in a bag and put them in his pocket. But he had to get dressed very quickly. And while this was going on, and I was looking just slightly out of the slightly open door, my two sisters were realizing what was going on and were crying terribly. And it rather embarrassed this young policeman. Things got worse after all that, I'm afraid. My mother came to the office and there was an SS man. He had taken over the firm. My mother noticed that he had put his greatcoat over the very hot central heating. And she said to him, "Well, you must mind your coat. It will be spoiled over our hot central heating." He was very grateful for that. And as a result, my mother said, the rest of the staff were treated more with respect than in most other firms. My mother had a way with her, and she also, she tried to imbue in us, which meant that she could talk to people even in very difficult circumstances. My father was in Sachsenhausen concentration camp, she discovered. My uncles were in other different ones, in part. There didn't seem to be much rhyme or reason. And she had to find certificates and things to try and indicate that these concentration camp inmates now could possibly be released. It took a long time to get all this work together, and it involved my mother going to the secret police headquarters in the Fichterstrasse, which is only a road or two away. To do that involved tremendous bravery. She told us afterwards, as she arrived at the bottom of the stairs in the police headquarters there, she saw one woman being thrown down the stairs there. But she managed to somehow get the various certificates for my father and his two brothers who were older than him. Unfortunately, the oldest brother, now in his 40s, died because there was no possible medical help when he suffered from appendicitis in the camp. We know how badly treated they were then, but the main treatment was just having nothing at all, not much food or anything. When my father eventually came out, this was after, at the very end of December, he it was almost very difficult to see that it was not our father. He'd become very, very thin. His hair had been completely shorn. And thank goodness my mother had always looked after him. When he went into concentration camp, he was quite portly, but now he'd become ever so thin. He had to take to his bed for a few days just to recover. But it was my father. It was our father. And we were glad to have him back. The other uncles also gradually came out, but not everybody did. We now realized that when this Hitler was not just a temporary, he was a force to be reckoned with, rather belatedly. Where should we go? We have to leave Germany. Should we go to Israel? Very difficult. There was a British mandate at the time. Go to America? They were very cagey about letting people in. Bolivia? Somebody went to Bolivia in our family. France? Somebody went from a good friend of my mother's went there with her husband. Shanghai, one of my Oma Etta, my mother's mother, was one of 10 children, and one of them went there. Another possibility was England. Now, England was difficult, but we did have some connections there. And one of we had a great aunt there, and she said she would look after me for a short time if I could get there. My Oma, once my grandfather had died, and his two sons took over the running of the firm, so did my grandmother and my mother's mother work in the office there. And she was very modern and far-sighted. She treated all the staff with great equality, for which they were very grateful. For instance, if a child had been born out of wedlock, she still gave them all the necessary for their welfare. One of those people married an Englishman and moved to England and worked at Bloomsbury House in London, which was then in charge of trying to get children out of Germany and Austria, because the difficulty was children could be sent, could be accepted. 10,000, after much heated debate in Parliament in this country, as you know, 10,000 children were allowed in, unaccompanied children were allowed in. However, the adults still had problems, and they had to have visas and all kinds of affidavits to not be a burden on this country. The Nazis made sure that we all, when we left Germany, only had 10 mark in our pockets. They robbed everybody, all the Jews, of everything they had. And of course, they also ransacked all the goods from the synagogue and everywhere else. And we were fortunate. We were still in our flat. My grandmother knew a businessman from England who said he would take me to my great aunt in Highgate in London. So I was the first to leave our household in January 1939, January the 8th, 9th. So he took me in hand from my father having just come out of concentration camp and rested. He took me to the big terminus in Leipzig, where this businessman took me in hand and accompanied me across the border. That as we were near the border, the Nazi people came in, and there were 6 of us there, and they rifled through everybody's trunk. Everybody had only one case, and I was the only youngster there, and in company with my Mr. Hartley. He wasn't very tall. He's an Englishman, spoke very good German. Fortunately, he was right beside me as all this was going on. One of the suitcases was thrown on the floor by the guard, by the Nazi border guard, and everything was spilled around the floor. Fortunately, mine was not treated that way, but it was an indication that things were not good. We moved on to Holland, and the Dutch people came in. Oh, quite different, jolly, wonderful. We all heaved a sigh of relief. We got onto Harwich. We got onto the Hook of Holland, and to take the steamboat to Harwich. It was dark by then. My Mr. Hartley saw to it that I got onto the boat, but I was in a top bunk, but he was not in the bottom bunk. He was in another. So I was with a stranger. It was a very stormy night, one of the stormiest nights they had for a while. And I was ever so sick, unfortunately. However, there was always somebody outside the door. They looked after me, I remember. But I looked very green when I arrived in England, where I live, Harwich and Liverpool Street Station. There, my aunt had sent her eldest daughter, an adult, Rady, to meet me. And she said how green I looked. I could hardly stand properly. I felt so ill. However, she took me to the Highgate flat where we had an oil stove to try and keep warm. And I slept on the floor behind the door, where my cousin, who was in the fur trade, working the fur trade, had to step over me every night. But I was glad to have somewhere to go. Somebody who was well looked after by my, as an ex-employee from the firm in my grandparents, she was working at Bloomsbury House, as I was saying before, and she heard that there was a school, a boarding school, that was going to offer a place for a 10-year-old child. And I was the lucky one to get that. I can only tell you, we were so fortunate when so many others were not. So after a few days, I went to this boarding school in Hastings. The following month, in February, my parents had to send my 2 younger sisters. One was 8 and the other was only 3. Sorry. I wonder what my parents felt when they had to let the 3-year-old go on the kinder transport, unaccompanied children. Well, my 8-year-old sister took charge of my 3-year-old. When they came to England, the 8-year-old sister was billeted with a nice family in Golders Green. And why did they do that? Because they had employed a German housemaid who was my mother's friend, and she persuaded the very nice, warm-hearted mother of the family there, the Rapsons, to take in my 8-year-old sister. So my 8-year-old sister had a home to go to. What about the 3-year-old? Well, she was billeted with a great aunt who was also housekeeper to a big house, a big drafty house in London. And before long, unfortunately, my 3-year-old sister became ill with ear infection, ended up in Great Ormond Street Hospital. Fortunately, there was a very nice doctor there, Mr. Ormond. Sorry, Mr. Forget the name. It'll come back in a minute. And he saw to it that once my little sister recovered, she was to go to the Wellgarth Nursery Nurses Training School. And that was a wonderful godsend, because that's where she was well looked after. Meanwhile, I was still at home at the boarding school, and it so happened that year the Easter was quite early, and when we were still at school at Easter, I was persuaded by a very nice to do this the same thing as all the other children, go to church on Sundays, and I was even in the choir eventually. But while I was there was a visiting bishop was giving the service, and he was very demonstrative, and he was saying how the Jews were killing our wonderful Savior, and he was sent to the cross. So I thought they knew, my comrade, my fellow students all knew I was Jewish. So when we came out of the service, I thought, well, I'll be getting some harsh words, but nobody ever mentioned anything. Would you believe it? England was a very different place to Germany at that time. Now I'm actually saying too much, too long.
That's okay.
My mother eventually came out of Germany and was in the household of the doctor who was Ormerod. I've got it now. Ormerod in Great Ormond Street, doctor. He needed a housekeeper in the summer, and my mother became their housekeeper. And so she had a place to go to. It was a busy house with three older sons. So when I came home in the summer, we met at a station. It was wonderful to see my mother. And she took me there, and I was in the top floor there for a few days. And then my uncle in Holland, who was happy, got his family all there. They had a nice house. He said, why doesn't Walter come and stay with us for the holidays? So my mother put me on the train at Liverpool Street Station, and I made the return journey to Holland, just as I'd done before. This time it was a very quiet crossing overnight. And in the morning, I was back in Hoek of Holland, and I spent a lovely few days with my, several weeks with my Uncle Rudolph and Auntie Bella, with the three cousins, also Stefan, Micha. They had a lovely house in Leiden. And one afternoon, my mother said, my auntie said, your father is coming out of Germany tomorrow morning. And he did. It was so wonderful, because he'd gone to the office time after time, and always some papers were not in order. But when he heard the word, they're all in order, he just packed his, took his briefcase, had his coat over his arm. This was August, of course, and traveled to Holland. And it was marvelous to see him. So we were lucky to have both mother and father and the three of us in England. We were actually on the way to the USA, but we had no brief to get there. So England very kindly took us on. Thanks to lots of wonderful people. I'm ever so grateful for that. I must also say that my headmaster was very great, wonderful to keep me for all these 3-4 years that he decided, even though war was about to come. When my father arrived, he was going to stay a few days and recover a bit. But the following morning, my aunt said, 2 officials had come to the door and said, we must go because war was about to be declared. So my father and I immediately went, took the first boat in the morning back to Harwich and Liverpool Street in England. It so happened, so I said, we hardly said goodbye to my cousins. And that was the last we were going to see them, because war did come. It was when we got to England, we heard that my mother had been taken by her family to their cottage in Bosham in Sussex for a holiday. And they'd invited my sister, my other sister, my older sister, to stay with them in Elizabeth Cottage in Bosham. So my father and I, the next morning after staying overnight in bed and breakfast in Paddington, we went to join them in Bosham. 3 days later, Sunday, the 3rd of September, I think it was, we were walking on the inland lake, which was at low ebb. There was a car there with a lady inside. She wound down the window and said, listen to the broadcast of Neville Chamberlain. War was declared. This was the start of World War II. The lady kindly offered my father a cigarette. He's usually a non-smoker. It's the first time I've seen him smoke. He was very worried, of course. We had still lots of people at risk in Nazi Germany. The next few days, amazingly, there was a little post office cum shop in this little Boston village. Everybody was kitted out with a gas mask. Now, the interesting thing is, although my father had only been there for a matter of a day or so, he was given a gas mask too, as were the children. In England, things were done quite differently to Germany. And there were all sorts of wonderful indications that we were welcome in this country. There's so much more I could tell you, but I think I'm overstepping time. There is a lot to be said yet. Maybe if you can ask me some questions. Shall I stop there now, Rabbi?
Well, Walter, it's been just such a privilege listening to you, and I don't think anybody will mind not being able to ask you a question this evening. I'm sure people would love to know just how you met Sylvia, though, because so many of our members have known Sylvia, and I think that's a very important point in your life. Yeah, maybe you just say a few words.
How I met Sylvia?
Yeah.
Well, I was working at St. George's Hospital in Hyde Park Corner. It was then, it's now a hotel. But it was I was working there, and in my lunch break, I used to go down the road to Harrods, who in this smart shop, as everybody knows, they then had a lovely offer of cards of all kinds at very reasonable prices in the big hall just through the swing doors, operated by the commissionaire in fine uniform. So I used to go down in there, and when I looked up one day, along a little corridor, I saw a wonderful girl in the paper pattern department. She didn't see me, but I had to keep my eyes on the cards in case the commissionaire tapped me on the shoulder. 2.5 years later, I met the same girl again at a folk dance in Cecil Sharp House, Camden. I'd enjoyed folk dancing, and Sylvia, as it turned out to be, she also did. And she came with her friend, and I was with a friend. I used to like walking in the tops of mountains, and this was a friend from Wales in the previous year, and I was with him, Philip, and Sylvia was with her friend, and we met during a dance, and we instantly clicked. It was only realized that she wasn't Jewish. That was a problem. It takes too long to say too much, but it took us 6 years before we decided that we would marry. We were converted by Rabbi Friedlander in the synagogue up here in London. It was the synagogue in
Westminster, I think it is.
Yes, well, before he came to Westminster, it was the just forgotten the name of the moment. It's no longer there. It's all moved to elsewhere, hasn't it? But
I'm not sure which one it is, but it doesn't matter.
It was
Rabbi Friedlander who married you.
Yes, Rabbi Friedlander, definitely, and he was very welcoming. And Sylvia converted, and we've been very close ever since. Of course, we moved there, from that synagogue when Rena was born, 73. 74, we moved to Hallowell Road, Northern Liverpool Synagogue, where your father was Rabbi. And of course, the rest is history. We can be so thankful for the Goldstein family.
Well, Walter, we are so thankful for you speaking with us today. There were so many things that stood out for me in listening to you. You painted such an incredible picture of normality, of ordinary detail, but in such precise detail that all of us, I'm sure, were utterly captivated, and for moments were imagining ourselves perhaps as children alongside you. You spoke so beautifully, and I know that we've got quite a lot of young people here as well, and they have, I'm sure, heard of the gentleness and kindness of your mother. And all of us who know you know that you certainly have been true to the values that your mother instilled in you, that you are such a gentle and kind human being, and have brought that to all of your work within our community as involvement with interfaith work, with Amnesty International locally, and the teacher of many of us here as well, and so many more. You have been such an important presence in my life, and you continue to be. Through this pandemic, your presence and resilience in particular, along with others such as Nellie and Sonia, are such beacons for us and give us all hope as well, as you have done throughout your life. Walter, I'm sure, and please do continue putting your messages to Walter in the chat, and we'll be able to save them and send them to Walter later. Walter, we're just so grateful that you have been such an incredibly active member of our community, along with Sylvia, and with your children as well growing up in the community. So many of us will consider ourselves your children as well.
Thank you.
Tonight,
very
Walter,
kind words.
Tonight, Walter, you have given us our way to commemorate on Yom Hashoah. You have done so in a gentle way, as you always do, and still your story not only, I'm sure, brings tears still to your eyes, but to ours as well. So many of us will have had our hearts torn, and perhaps I know that most important to you and signified by your work for Amnesty International, and always being present when we have events surrounding refugees within our community. Perhaps we will redouble our own efforts to do everything we can to ensure that especially unaccompanied minors, who you talked about earlier, but all refugees have fair treatment within this country, just as you were fortunate in your family to be able to receive as well. I'm now just going to recite in English the words of El Maleh Rachamim, and then invite you to join me in reciting Kaddish with me. El Maleh Rachamim, God full of compassion, exalted God, grant perfect rest under the wings of your presence, among the holy and pure who shine as the brightness of the firmament, to the souls of the millions of our people who died for the sanctification of your name. Merciful God, shelter them forever under your wings, and let their souls be bound up in the bond of eternal life. May they find their destiny in your nearness, and may they rest in peace. And let us say, Amen. And we all think of our own loved ones and friends who were murdered in the Shoah. We think of all of those from our Torah scroll towns, now from our adopted communities in Lviv and Lutsk, and we think of all of our people who were murdered. And for them, now we join our voices together, maybe poignantly because you will only hear your own voice and mine. Perhaps that's a little bit representative that there are silences and voices missing. But hopefully also to give us hope that this evening, as we have had so many people here together with you, Walter, and also on our live streams as well, Leah and I reckon probably nearly 250 people with us, that this voice, your voice, will always be heard. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbi, be'alma divrach yirutei v'yamlich malchutei, b'chai echon v'yom echon v'chayei dechol Beit Yisrael, ba'agalau v'zman kariv v'imru amen. Hei shemei Rabba mavarach le'olam u'lalmei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ah v'yitromam v'yitnasei. V'tada v'talei v'talal shemei d'kudusha brichu. Le'ela minko birchata v'shirata. Tushbechata v'nechemata. Da'amiran ba'alma v'imru amen. Hei shlama Rabba min Shemaya. V'chaim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. V'imru amen. Osei shalom bimromav. Hu ya'asei shalom. Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. V'al kol b'nei Adam. V'imru amen. May the Most High, source of perfect peace, grant peace to us, and I'll be exclusive tonight, to your people, Israel. And let us say, Amen. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and thank you in particular, Walter, for being such an incredible speaker with us this evening. We know that we hope that you can feel the love from each of us this evening. I will send you all of the words of the chat as soon as I finish teaching Hebrew later on. Well, you were my Hebrew teacher, weren't you, Walter? So
yeah, well, I think it's more your family, I think, that really did that. So you have such a wonderful pedigree there.
Thank you so much, Walter, for everything. We're going to stop the room now because I'm sure it's been an exhausting experience for Walter as well. Those of you who know where Walter is, well, I'm sure will send your own messages, but also maybe leave him in a little bit of a peace as well to recuperate. Walter, thank you so very much indeed. Thank you to everybody for joining us this evening.